minute. If my show hadn't have funded this expedition, you wouldn't have...
That's your story, lady.
At first glance, you'd probably assume these games came from a completely different generation of consoles. But they didn't. Every single one of these games was running on the exact same hardware, the PlayStation 3. Released back in 2006, the PS3 was an absolute monster of a machine. Sony claimed its Cell processor and the RSX graphics processor could deliver around 2 teraflops of performance. And that all sounds well and good, but there was a problem. A pretty big problem. The PS3 was notoriously difficult to develop for, and that makes what happens over the next 7 years even more impressive. Because developers didn't get better hardware to work with, they just got better at using the one they already had. So how did the PS3 graphics evolve so dramatically throughout its lifetime? Let's go jump down this rabbit hole together. When the PS3 launched, it represented a massive leap over the PlayStation 2. Suddenly, developers were working with high-definition displays, much more sophisticated shaders, dramatically more detailed character models, and much larger environments. The GPU was based on NVIDIA technology and featured programmable shaders, hardware anti-aliasing, and 256MB of dedicated graphics memory. But the PS3 wasn't just simply a more powerful PS2. Its architecture was radically different. At the center of the system was the Cell processor. It contained a PowerPC-based main processor alongside multiple SPUs. These could be used for things like physics, animation, geometry processing, and other demanding tasks. Sony even highlighted how developers could use the Cell's SPUs for additional graphics processing. But this is where the problems began, because actually getting all of this hardware to work together efficiently was extremely difficult. Early PS3 games therefore didn't necessarily represent what the hardware was capable of. They represented what developers had managed to extract from it. And that distinction is incredibly important. One of the best examples of an early PS3 game is Resistance: Fall of Man. For a launch window game, Resistance looked impressive. It had large environments, plenty of enemies, impressive particle effects, and a distinctly next-generation presentation. But put it next to a late-generation PS3 game and the difference is enormous. Character faces were relatively basic, textures were less detailed, lighting was simpler, environments contained fewer objects, and materials didn't have the same level of realism. But that's not because the PS3 suddenly became more powerful, it's because developers became more experienced with the hardware. They were learning how to divide workloads between the Cell and RSX. They were learning how to manage the console's extremely limited memory. And they were learning how to build rendering techniques specifically around the hardware. Because the PS3's memory architecture was pretty restrictive. There was 256MB of XDR memory for the system and another 256MB of GDDR3 for graphics. And that's tiny by modern standards. And developers had to constantly decide what data should be kept in memory and what could be streamed or discarded. Even PS3 development tutorials highlighted memory management as a major consideration when working with the system. This meant developers had a choice. They could either continue to make subpar games on the PS3, or they could tackle it from a completely different angle. In 2007, a game released for PS3 that changed everything. Uncharted: Drake's Fortune. Suddenly, the PS3 started to look like a completely different machine. Naughty Dog was becoming extremely good at exploiting the Cell processor. Character animation had become more sophisticated, environments became more detailed, lighting improved, water, fire, smoke and explosions became more convincing. And most importantly, the characters started to feel alive. Nathan Drake wasn't simply a collection of polygons, his clothing reacted to the environment, his animations blended together, his face communicated emotion. Because if Uncharted showed us what developers were beginning to understand, the next game showed us what the PS3 could really do. In 2009, Guerrilla Games released Killzone 2. And this was one of those moments where people were genuinely asking, how is this running on a PS3? Killzone 2 was an enormous leap. The environments were packed with geometry, lighting was dramatically more sophisticated. Particle effects filled the screen, smoke interacted with the environment, and explosions illuminated nearby surfaces. The game's distinctive visual effects created an incredibly cinematic presentation. But there was something else happening behind the scenes. Developers were finally becoming much better at using the PS3's architecture. The cell SPUs could be used for tasks that traditionally would have placed additional pressure on the main CPU or GPU. Sony itself described the SPUs being used for demanding tasks, including geometry processing, animation, and compression. This was the beginning of the PS3's transformation. Developers weren't just learning how to make games for the PS3, they were learning how to bend the hardware around their engines. Then came the game that, for many, became the definitive demonstration of the PS3's incredible hardware. Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. The difference between Uncharted 1 and 2 is remarkable. Characters became more detailed, facial animation became more convincing, environments became larger and denser, lighting became more natural, and animations became smoother. Naughty Dog was able to create huge cinematic sequences without sacrificing the game's interactive nature. This is where the PS3 generation started to blur the line between games and movies. And there's an important lesson here. The PS3 hadn't received a GPU upgrade, it hadn't received more RAM, it hadn't suddenly become faster. The hardware was the same, but it's the software that evolved. So what exactly was happening? The cell processor was strange, very strange. But once developers understood it, those SPUs could become incredibly useful. Instead of asking the RSX to do everything, developers could move certain workloads onto the cell. Animation, physics, particles, geometry processing, even parts of the rendering pipeline. This allowed developers to build engines specifically designed around the PS3. And that became one of the biggest reasons late generation PS3 games could look so much better than early ones. It wasn't the hardware that had changed, it was the knowledge of how to use it. Then Sony Santa Monica showed us something else, God of War 3. And visually it was ridiculous. The scale of the environments was enormous. Characters became incredibly detailed. Kratos himself had vastly more sophisticated geometry and textures than characters from the early PS3 games. The environments were filled with enormous structures, particles, lighting effects, and dynamic elements. And the game maintained an incredibly cinematic presentation, while throwing huge amounts of detail onto the screen. And then Quantic Dreams pushed the PS3 into another direction, Beyond Two Souls. This wasn't about enormous open worlds, it was about characters. Faces, skin, hair, eyes, subtle lighting, performance capture, and cinematic rendering. The technology allowed characters such as Jodie and Nathan Dawkins to look dramatically more realistic than the characters we saw at the beginning of this generation. And this is where you can really see how far character rendering had evolved. Compare an early PS3 face with that of a late generation PS3 face. And then 2013, the end of the PS3 generation. Naughty Dog releases The Last of Us, and suddenly we're looking at something that seemed almost impossible. This is still the same console that had launched with Resistance: Fall of Man. But look at Joel, Ellie, look at their faces, look at the environments, the vegetation, the lighting, the shadows, materials, animation, the destruction, the particles. Just the sheer density of detail. The Last of Us is arguably the perfect demonstration of what happened during the PS3's lifetime. The hardware didn't evolve dramatically, the developers did. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about the PS3 is that when it launched, developers were still figuring it out. And by the time the generation ended, some studios had become masters of the hardware. And that's why comparing launch games with late generation games can almost feel unfair. Resistance: Fall of Man was built by developers learning what the PS3 could do, and The Last of Us was built by developers who had spent years discovering how to make that hardware work for them. The difference is experience, optimization, technology, better engines, and better tools, and a deeper understanding of the cell processor. It began with games that looked undeniably next generation, and ended with games that still look impressive today. 7 years, one console, and an absolutely enormous evolution in what developers could achieve with it. And perhaps that's the most impressive thing about the PS3. It didn't get hardware upgrades, there was no PS3 Pro. The developers themselves became the upgrade. And if you ever wondered why some of the final PS3 games looked almost like they belonged to the next generation, now you know. The PS3 wasn't becoming more powerful, we were simply getting better at unlocking the power that was already there. If you like this deep dive into the PS3, then please do consider hitting that subscribe button for more content like this.